In this video, we'll be talking very quickly about AWS Code Deploy. Code Deploy is a deployment service that automates deployments to Amazon EC2 instances, on-premise instances, or serverless Lambda functions, and it's designed to work hand in hand with the other AWS developer tools, Code Commit, Code Build, and Code Pipeline. You can deploy a nearly unlimited variety of application content, such as source code, serverless AWS Lambda functions, web and configuration files, executables, packages, scripts, multimedia files, and just about anything else you need to deploy. Code Deploy can deploy application content that runs on a server and is stored in S3 buckets, GitHub repositories, or Bitbucket repositories. Code Deploy can also deploy a serverless Lambda function. You don't need to make changes to your existing code before you can use Code Deploy. Code Deploy makes it easier for you to rapidly release new features, update AWS Lambda function versions, avoid downtime during application deployment, and handle the complexity of updating your applications without many of the risks associated with error-prone manual deployments. Code Deploy lets you deploy both traditional applications on servers and applications that deploy a serverless AWS Lambda function version. Code Deploy fully automates your application deployments across your development, test, and production environments. It also scales with your infrastructure so that you can deploy to one instance or thousands. Code Deploy also helps maximize your application availability. During an in-place deployment, Code Deploy performs a rolling update across Amazon EC2 instances. You can specify the number of instances to be taken offline at a time for updates. During a blue-green deployment, the latest application revision is installed on replacement instances, and traffic is rerouted to these instances when you choose, either immediately or as soon as you are done testing the new environment. For both deployment types, Code Deploy tracks application health according to rules you configure. You also have the ability to automatically or manually stop and roll back deployments if there are errors. You can launch and track the status of your deployments through the AWS Code Deploy console or the AWS CLI. You receive a report that lists when each application revision was deployed and to which EC2 instances. It's also easy to adopt. Code Deploy is platform agnostic and works with any application. You can easily reuse your setup code. Code Deploy can also integrate with your software release process or continuous delivery toolchain. Code Deploy is able to deploy applications to two compute platforms. Your first option is EC2 or on-premises. Code Deploy will describe instances of physical servers that can be EC2 cloud instances, on-premises servers, or both. Applications created using this option can be composed of executable files, configuration files, images, and more. Deployments that use the EC2 on-premises compute platform manage the way in which traffic is directed to instances by using an in-place or blue-green deployment type. For the AWS Lambda compute platform, this one is used to deploy applications that consist of updated versions of Lambda functions. AWS Lambda manages the Lambda functions in a serverless compute environment made up of a high availability compute structure. All administration of the compute resources is performed by AWS Lambda. Now let's take a moment to go over the different components of Code Deploy. The first is a deployment group. For EC2 and on-premises options, the deployment group deploys a set of instances to which a new revision is deployed. For the AWS Lambda option, it deploys a new Lambda function version on a high availability compute infrastructure. Next are the actual deployments. For the EC2 and on-premises option, the deployment phase deploys a new revision that consists of an application and app spec file. The app spec specifies how to deploy the application to the instances in a deployment group. For the AWS Lambda option, deployments deploy a new revision that consists of an app spec file. The app spec once again specifies which Lambda function version to deploy. Next are deployment configurations. For EC2 and on-premises, deployment configurations are a group of settings that determine the deployment speed and the minimum number of instances that must be healthy at any point during a deployment. For AWS Lambda, Deployment configurations are settings that determine how traffic is shifted to the updated Lambda function versions. And finally, there's the application itself, which for EC2 and on-premises is a collection of deployment groups and revisions. An EC2 on-premises application uses the EC2 on-premises compute platform. Similarly, for AWS Lambda, an application is a collection of revisions. A Lambda application uses the Lambda compute platform. We'll cover how to use code deploy in more detail in a future lab, but for now, that'll wrap up our introduction to AWS Code Deploy. So if that makes sense, then feel free to move on.